Some events don't arrive with warnings. They arrive like a question that splits history in half. On March 8th, 1944, at precisely 14:37 hours, one such question came dragging smoke across the grey sky of Suffolk. By that point in the war, numbers told a story no human voice could soften. 184 damaged bombers had limped toward RAF Woodbridge in the previous 4 months. 17 never reached a full stop. Across the entire European air campaign, the 8th Air Force had already lost more than 800 heavy bombers since January, not all to enemy fire, but to the quiet, merciless chaos of returning home in machines pushed beyond their limits. So here is the hook that kept every man on that base frozen. Why was this one coming in even faster than the aircraft that crashed before it? Why did this B-17 look less like a landing attempt and more like a runaway judgment barreling toward the runway? Flight Lieutenant Michael Reynolds stood inside the control tower, binoculars tight to his face, studying the incoming fortress. He'd seen tired wings before, seen engines hauling blades out of pure stubbornness, seen landing gears shaking like exhausted knees. But this machine coming in flat and hot felt wrong in a new way. 145 miles per hour, maybe more. A B-17 was supposed to approach at 110. Everyone knew that rhythm. Everyone trusted it. But this fortress wasn't descending. It was charging, almost level, almost defiant. Reynolds' instincts, shaped by endless nights of listening to engines cough across blacked-out coastlines, flared. Was this pilot fighting failing hydraulics? A jammed control surface? A runaway trim tab? Or was this something else entirely, something no manual had prepared them for? He grabbed the radio, sent the warning. No reply. The bomber crossed the runway threshold like a steel ghost, fed by belief alone. Too fast, too straight, too committed. Reynolds reached for the crash alarm, thinking of the families who would receive letters, thinking of the men who had survived the worst skies only to face their final moments on British soil. But then, at 20 feet, the pilot did what no rulebook had ever dared to imagine. He cut every engine to idle. He hauled the control yoke into his chest, and he forced the aircraft into a deliberate stall. The wings quit flying. The giant fell. Straight down, a controlled impact violent in sound, but precise in intention. Landing gear screamed, flexed, held. The bomber bounced once, then settled, rolling to a stunned halt in less than 2,000 feet. Reynolds lowered his binoculars with shaking hands. He had just witnessed something impossible, a maneuver that looked like surrender but was actually strategy, a fall engineered to save lives. What he didn't know, what no one at Woodbridge yet understood, was that this single moment would ignite a quiet revolution. Because somewhere out there, a young American captain had started asking the most dangerous question of all. What if the rules designed to keep pilots safe were the very rules putting them in danger? And that question was about to rewrite everything. War doesn't just reshape nations. It reshapes the very definition of what safe means. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had turned into a relentless proving ground where statistics cut deeper than steel. And every pilot knew the numbers, not because they memorized them, but because they lived inside them. The 8th Air Force was sending more than 1,000 heavy bombers over enemy territory on single missions, an aerial armada unmatched in world history. 10 men inside each fortress, thousands of miles, 10 hours of flight, everything at stake. And the cost? The cost was a tide that kept rising. Between January and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost over 800 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, a staggering figure, even by wartime standards. On the ground, planners called it attrition. In the air, crews called it something simpler, survival, reduced to a percentage. And that percentage could break your spirit. The day known as Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943, lingered in every briefing room like a ghost that refused to sit down. 291 B-17 seconds launched for Schweinfurt. 60 didn't come home. Another 17 were too damaged to ever fly again. More than 600 airmen were killed, injured, or taken prisoner. A single day, a 26% loss rate, enough to hollow out an entire wing. But numbers like these, terrifying as they were, hid another truth, a quieter truth, a truth waiting at the end of every mission. Because for every bomber swallowed by flak and fighters over Germany, 2 or 3 returned to England, ripped open, limping across the coast with systems failing, engines hauling blades on sheer will, and hydraulics dragging dust through the floorboards. Those aircraft weren't done fighting. They were struggling through the final mile, the most overlooked battlefield of the entire air war. And that battlefield was the runway. The training manuals insisted that a B-17 was safest when flown by the book. 110 miles per hour on approach. Gentle flare at 20 feet. Smooth reduction of power. Touchdown at 90. Rollout under full control. It was elegant, logical, mathematically perfect for an aircraft that was whole. But by 1944, whole had become a luxury. Bombers limped home with hydraulic lines severed, brakes non-functional, tires shredded, gear locked at crooked angles, flaps frozen, ailerons lagging or unresponsive, engines coughing smoke like they were breathing through torn lungs. Pilots weren't guiding aircraft anymore. They were guiding wrecks with wings. And the cold truth was this: standard procedures required precision. Damaged aircraft couldn't give precision. The mismatch was fatal. RAF Woodbridge, the emergency strip designed specifically for these crippled giants, saw it firsthand. In just 4 months, from November 1943 to February 1944, 17 returning bombers were lost during landing attempts not over hostile territory, but within sight of safety. Medical officers described the pattern in careful, sanitized language, but everyone on the base knew what it meant. Crews who had survived the worst skies in the world were losing their lives during the final 30 seconds of flight. It wasn't flak. It wasn't fighters. It wasn't the cold, or the fuel, or the miles. It was the rules. Commanders clung to the belief that standardized landings kept pilots safe. After all, thousands of crews had trained on these procedures across Texas, Kansas, New Mexico. The logic was rock solid. Teach one safe way. Reinforce it. Burn it into muscle memory. Prevent improvisation. Improvisation, according to every manual, was a path toward disaster. But conditions over Europe had outgrown the manuals. And the manuals didn't know how to land a fortress with one flap frozen, one gear half extended, one engine fading, and the pilot fighting both gravity and a control column that moved with the stiffness of concrete. The longer a damaged bomber stayed in the air on final approach, the greater the chance of losing what little control remained. A standard landing took 60 to 90 seconds from final turn to touchdown. For aircraft already barely flying, that minute plus felt like an eternity. Hydraulics drained. Fuel pressure stuttered. Flaps sagged. Engines coughed. Heat-soaked metal warped in the slipstream. Every second was a chance for something essential to quit. Pilots reported that the cockpit felt like a room slowly collapsing inward. The instruments jittered. The yoke pushed back. The aircraft refused to obey clean inputs. You weren't flying. You were negotiating with physics while holding the sky together by hope and adrenaline. And still, the book said, maintain the glide. Hold 110. Flare gently. Land like the aircraft is whole. But the aircraft wasn't whole. The war had changed the machines. The rules had not. This was the breaking point where logic split into 2 paths. One path clung to procedures. The other stared at the reality of damaged aircraft and asked for something new, something daring, something counterintuitive, something built not from theory, but from survival. And somewhere, watching friends die, not in battle but in the final seconds of landing, one young captain started to believe the unthinkable. Maybe the safest way to land a wounded bomber was to stop trying to land it the safe way. Some innovations begin in laboratories. Others begin in silence, the kind that settles inside a man who's watched too many friends vanish into the margins of a war report. For Captain Howard Buie, age 26, the silence arrived not in the skies over Germany, but on the runways of England, where bombers that survived the hardest missions collapsed within sight of safety. Buie flew with the 388th Bomb Group, a unit hammered by the full weight of the air campaign. By February 1944, he'd completed 18 missions: Hamburg, Brunswick, Frankfurt, Berlin, the kinds of names whispered in briefings like they carried their own gravity. On those missions, he watched fortresses return with holes big enough to step through, engines coughing fire, wings patched with sheet metal, crews fed by belief more than fuel. He also watched something darker: aircraft that made it back across the North Sea only to fail during the last desperate seconds of landing. It wasn't rare. It wasn't unpredictable. It had become a pattern. At emergency strips like RAF, Woodbridge and Manston, controllers logged hundreds of crippled bombers per month. In just a 3-month window, Woodbridge recorded 17 landing losses, aircraft destroyed not by enemy action, but by procedures that demanded more than damaged machines could give. Army Air Force's analysts quietly noted that, by winter 1943-44, nearly 1 in 4 severely damaged bombers attempting to land never fully stopped on the runway. Buie wasn't a theorist, not a test pilot, not an engineer with formulas pinned to laboratory walls. He was a working pilot, a combat operator. His education was the sky itself, the way a bomber responded when a control cable snapped, when hydraulic pressure bled out, when an engine dragged dust across the slipstream, trying to keep up. And slowly, a question sharpened inside him. If the long, graceful landing approach was killing damaged aircraft, why were they still being forced to fly it? That question turned into obsession after a February afternoon when Buie watched a returning B-17 bounce down its home runway. Each impact worsened the damage until the gear folded and the bomber slid in a burst of sparks. 3 men didn't survive. What struck Buie wasn't the crash he'd seen crashes. It was the why. The bomber still had flying speed on touchdown, still had lift, still wanted to fly when it needed to stay down. As Buie's flight engineer muttered, if it hadn't been flying when it hit, that bouncing never would have happened. The sentence hung in the air like a match over tinder. What if the safest way for a wounded bomber to land was to make sure it wasn't flying at all? Not a flare, not a glide, a controlled fall. It sounded reckless. It sounded backwards. It sounded like the kind of idea that gets a man grounded or worse. But Buie couldn't shake it, and the more he studied it, the more every variable aligned. A damaged bomber still had strengths. It could fly straight for short bursts. It could maintain control at higher speeds. Its gear was built to absorb massive vertical loads. What it couldn't do, not reliably, was descend slowly, gently, precisely. So on the 23rd of February 1944, Buie walked into his squadron commander's office and asked permission to test an alternate emergency landing profile. Lieutenant Colonel William Creer, who'd lost 7 aircraft recently to landing accidents, granted him a single test flight. Buie took up an old war-weary B-17 serial number 42-31983, a veteran machine relegated to training after taking too many hits in combat. He climbed to 5,000 feet over Suffolk, leveled off, and did the most forbidden thing in Army Air Force's doctrine. He deliberately stalled the aircraft on approach. The fortress bucked, the warning horn blared, the nose dropped like a stone. Buie recovered at 100 feet, chest tight, breath sharp. His co-pilot stared at him like the sky had cracked open. Again, 5 attempts, 5 controlled stalls, 5 recoveries. By the end of the session, Buie had discovered something extraordinary. Stalling a B-17 on purpose at the right height, with the right timing, produced a perfectly level, perfectly aligned, perfectly survivable impact. No bouncing, no rolling, no collapse, and dramatically less time for damaged systems to fail. He spent the next 3 days refining it, Approach fast 135 to 145 miles per hour. Hold power until the final breath of altitude. At 20 feet, power off. Yoke back. Let gravity finish the job. He was no longer experimenting. He was building a method that could rewrite the survival equation of the air war. But ideas don't change history by themselves. They collide with institutions. They spark arguments. They challenge the very rules meant to keep aviators alive. And Buie's technique, radical as it was about to walk straight into a room full of commanders who believed that stalling an aircraft near the ground wasn't innovation. By early March 1944, whispers had begun spreading across airfields from Suffolk to Cambridgeshire. Mechanics talked about it while tightening bolts. Flight engineers argued about it over cold rations. Pilots leaned in during late-night coffee, eyes sharp with equal parts hope and disbelief. A captain, a kid, really, 26 years old, had pulled off something impossible. A deliberate stall at 20 feet. A wounded bomber dropped clean onto the runway and lived to taxi home. Word traveled fast in wartime. News always does when lives hang on it. But news also traveled upward, straight toward the one place where new ideas were routinely interrogated, dissected, or buried. 8th Bomber Command Headquarters. And that is where Captain Howard Buie found himself on March 12th, standing at the front of a briefing room filled with 23 of the highest-ranking operations officers, commanders, and safety inspectors in the theater, men who carried the weight of responsibility for thousands of aircrew, men who had seen doctrines built, tested, broken, but who still believed in rules written for safety, rules that Buie had deliberately broken. The room radiated skepticism even before he spoke, arms crossed, pens tapping, eyes measuring. Behind them, losses mounted like a ledger no one wanted to read aloud. Since the war began, landing accidents, not combat, not weather, not mechanical failure, had claimed over 3,500 American airmen in the European theater. Not in enemy territory, nor during bombing runs, but on approach to their own runways. The numbers were never printed on posters or announced in speeches. They were buried in after-action logs, but the commanders in this room knew them by heart. Still, accepting Buie's technique meant rewriting the most sacred doctrine of aviation. Never stall an aircraft close to the ground. Colonel James Wilson, Chief of Flight Safety, opened the meeting like a hammer dropping on metal. Captain Buie, you are asking us to endorse a maneuver that violates every approach procedure we teach. You are asking us to authorize intentional loss of lift at an altitude with no margin for recovery. Do you understand the gravity of that? Buie didn't flinch. Yes, sir, I do. And I also understand the gravity of losing 23% of damaged bombers attempting standard landings. A low murmur rippled through the room. Wilson pressed. Why should pilots be taught something that looks indistinguishable from a mistake? Buie answered with numbers, not emotion. In the past 2 weeks, sir, I have executed 31 power, off-stall demonstrations, all successful, no injury, no damage. And every one of those approaches reduced the time under stress from 90 seconds, he paused, letting the figure sit, to 15. 90 seconds versus 15. A gulf wide enough to swallow an aircraft whose hydraulics were bleeding out second by second. Buie continued, the words sharp and steady. A damaged bomber can fly straight. It can fly fast. What it can't do is fly gracefully, and our current procedures demand grace. For the first time, a few heads in the room lifted. Then the counter-arguments came hard. It's reckless. It's dangerous. You'll encourage pilots to use it when they shouldn't. We'll lose more aircraft in training than we save in combat. The clash felt like two eras colliding, the established one built on predictability, and the new one shaped by the brutal realities of 1944. Then the moment that changed the temperature of the room. Brigadier General Frederick Castle stood. Castle commanded the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing, a unit punched hard by the air war. He had lost 11 bombers in landing accidents in the past 4 months alone. Men he had briefed hours before, men he'd expected to see return. "I've watched Captain Buie perform this maneuver," Castle said, voice low but carrying weight. "I've reviewed the film, and I've spoken with the crews who saw it work. Gentlemen, we are sending aircraft into the harshest air battles in history. They come home bent, battered, half alive. Standard procedures aren't designed for aircraft in that condition. Captain Buie has created one that is." Silence. Thick, heavy. Wilson looked from Castle to Buie, then to the data, then back to the room. Finally, he spoke the words that opened a new chapter in aviation. "I want 50 more demonstrations. I want standardized training. I want restrictions, strict ones. But if those conditions are met, we will authorize emergency use." 3 days later, the order was drafted. 1 week later, the wording was finalized. And on March 19th, 1944, Technical Order 123 was issued. The power-off stall landing was officially approved for combat-damaged aircraft. A rule rewritten, a doctrine reshaped, a pathway opened not just for survival, but for hope. Some victories in war don't explode across headlines, they arrive quietly, like a breath returning to a body you thought was gone. When Technical Order 123 became official doctrine, there were no brass bands, no speeches, no rows of medals pinned in formation. There was only a runway, a damaged aircraft, and the sight of 10 men stepping down alive. That alone was enough to reorder the sky. 3 days after the order was issued, RAF Woodbridge received a call that snapped every head toward the radio. A B-17 was coming home from a deep strike mission, dragging smoke, hauling blades, fed by belief more than anything mechanical. Hydraulics were draining fast, the main tires were shredded. One engine kept coughing like it wanted to sleep. Before the new directive, controllers would have braced for the worst, another bomber that survived the hostile skies, only to fail moments from safety. But now, the landscape had changed. They had a maneuver born of logic, risk, and a young captain's refusal to accept that surviving Germany only to fall on British soil was fate. The pilot came in fast, 142 miles per hour, cutting across the threshold like a steel shadow. And then, exactly as Buie had taught, the power dropped to idle, the yoke pulled back, the wings surrendered their lift. The bomber fell like a hammer and slammed down hard enough to shake the ground. It bounced once, settled, and rolled to a stop. 10 men climbed down without a scratch. The revolution had begun quiet, practical, unstoppable. Over the next 5 months, Woodbridge recorded 127 landings using Buie's technique. Of those, 119 succeeded. A 94% survival rate for aircraft so damaged that earlier procedures predicted catastrophe. Across Woodbridge, Manston and Carnaby, more than 2,400 crippled bombers would limp toward their runways between March 1944 and VE Day. Analysts later estimated that roughly 40% used variations of Buie's method. And from those numbers came a revelation that echoed far beyond military archives. Somewhere between 500 and 800 airmen survived because a 26-year-old captain refused to let outdated rules dictate their fate. Some of those men became legends. On May 7th, 1944, Captain Robert "Rosie" Rosenthal brought home a fortress so torn apart that German fighters had simply abandoned it, assuming it wouldn't make it across the channel. 2 engines failing, hydraulics dying, one tire already unwinding into thread. Before Technical Order 123, Rosenthal's crew would have had nothing left but hope and a long glide into uncertainty. Instead, he came in hot, called out the altitudes, cut power at 18 feet, and dropped the aircraft onto the runway in a jolt that felt like the earth punching back. The gear held. The aircraft veered. Rosenthal corrected. They rolled to a stop. All 10 lived. Years later, Rosenthal would say, "That fall, that hard fall, is the reason we didn't become another statistic." And every pilot who used the method knew exactly what he meant. What changed after the order wasn't just survival statistics, it was psychology. Before Buie's maneuver, crews returning in damaged aircraft feared the approach more than the mission. Flak and fighters were expected dangers, but the runway was treacherous in a quieter, crueler way. A damaged B-17 needed precision, control authority, stability attributes. It simply didn't possess anymore. Pilots said the cockpit felt like a room collapsing in slow motion, every gauge jittering, every surface fighting the pilot's hands. But after Buie's technique spread, something shifted. For the first time, crews arrived over the coast with a plan, an option engineered for the beaten, the broken, the aircraft held together by tape, prayer, and momentum. Controllers reported that returning airmen stepped down with a look they hadn't seen in months, relief that didn't hide behind shock, confidence not eroded by fear. Buie's achievement wasn't loud, but it was profound. He never called himself a hero, never tried to engrave his name into the story, never chased credit. When asked why he pursued the idea, he answered with the simple clarity of someone who had buried too many friends. "I just didn't want to see any more crews go down on landing." But the deeper legacy stretched far beyond the 8th Air Force. Aviation doctrine, civilian and military, began shifting toward a truth that now sits at the core of pilot training worldwide. Procedures guide pilots, but judgment saves them. One-size-fits-all rules break under the weight of extreme circumstances. Flexibility, the courage to adapt, to think, to reimagine, is what keeps aircraft and people alive. You could see echoes of Buie's logic decades later in the high-energy landing profile of the space shuttle, a machine that couldn't go around, couldn't flare gently, couldn't pretend conditions were normal. Test pilots leaned into Buie's principle: stay fast, stay controllable, commit late, reduce the time, window where failure steals control. RAF Woodbridge closed in 1993, but the runway remains long, straight, sun-bleached. A plaque marks the 4,200 emergency landings made there during the war. It does not mention Buie's name. It doesn't need to. Veteran pilots who visit remember everything: the engines dragging dust, the final turn over the North Sea, the yoke pulled back in that breath before gravity took over, the fall that looked like surrender but delivered survival. The moment wheels hit the earth and 10 men understood they would see another dawn. And they remember that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't in breaking through the enemy's defenses, it's in breaking through your own. A young captain taught wounded giants how to fall, and fall in a way that let them live.